Hey, remember the days when folks had to whip up desserts on a shoestring? Well, today we're traveling back to the early 1900s through the Great Depression era to explore 20 cheap sweet treats that once brought joy to tough times. So grab your spoon and buckle up for an unforgettable stroll down memory lane. You'll be surprised about how inventive people could get when sugar was scarce. Let's dive in. Number 1. Water pie. Despite its unusual name, water pie was a thrift-savvy way to satisfy cravings when resources were scarce. The Depression dessert involved pouring water into a basic crust, sprinkling on whatever sugar and flour were available, and topping it all off with bits of margarine. Now, as basic as it sounds, the magic happened in the baking. The top layer would form a sweet, gelatinous filling once heated in the oven. It was light, almost custard-like, though not as rich as modern pies. Because sugar could be expensive, home cooks often experimented with corn syrup, honey, or molasses to stretch their sweeteners. Some folks even replaced milk with powdered or evaporated milk if they had extra on hand. Water pie was meant to be served warm or cold, depending on the family preference. While it never became a 5-star dessert by any stretch, this frugal pie was a symbol of resourcefulness. Its simplicity reminds us just how clever home cooks had to be. Every cent had to work overtime. Sweeteners were among the first luxuries to go. Jokes aside, water pie tasted far better than the name suggests, even if it wasn't exactly brimming with flavor. Even so, those who remember it often get a nostalgic twinkle in their eye. Number 2. Chocolate mayonnaise pie. Chocolate mayonnaise pie might sound strange to modern ears, but it was a popular trick to make a moist cake without eggs or butter. When you consider the ingredients, mayonnaise is basically a mixture of oil and eggs, so it made sense. The tangy zip from the mayo added depth to the chocolate flavor, creating a surprisingly decadent experience. In the 1930s, an egg shortage meant that people had to find creative solutions for baking. Mayonnaise was cheaper than fresh eggs and came in large jars that stored well, making it an easy substitute. The recipe usually called for a combination of flour, sugar, baking soda, cocoa powder, and mayonnaise. A dash of vanilla also might find its way in. Once baked, the cake was layered or frosted with a homemade frosting, often using more mayonnaise if things were really tight. And the result? A dessert reminiscent of fudge cake. It had a velvety crumb with an almost velour-like texture. Number 3. Prune pudding. Prune pudding was one of those gritty yet surprisingly sweet creations that found popularity in the early to mid-1900s. Prunes were cheap and touted as healthy for digestion. When money was tight, desserts that doubled as semi-healthy treats were especially prized by moms that were trying to keep families going. Prune pudding combined cooked prunes mashed with a bit of sugar, possibly molasses, and a small amount of flour or cornstarch for thickening. Eggs were not always guaranteed, so some recipes omitted them entirely. Home cooks would simmer prunes in water until they were soft, and then mash them to form a puree. Mixing sugar in was a matter of taste and availability. The mixture was often spiced with cinnamon or nutmeg, and then slowly simmered or baked until it resembled a custardy pudding. No fancy toppings or whipped cream required. Number 4. Mock apple pie. Mock apple pie is an iconic example of culinary creativity. Rather than real apples, this pie famously used crackers. Yes, salty soda crackers that were soaked in a syrup spiced with cinnamon, sugar, and lemon juice to mimic the texture and taste of apple filling. Many recollect the brand Ritz even pushing a marketing campaign for the recipe, showcasing how to use their crackers to achieve the illusion of apple chunks. The story behind mock apple pie goes deeper than just some brand promotion. During times when produce was scarce or too expensive, resourceful home bakers discovered that crackers could produce a texture that was reminiscent of boiled apples once you layered the spices right. The secret was letting the syrup soak in enough so the crackers softened but maintained a slight bite. Now, the goal wasn't necessarily health, but fulfilling a craving for a beloved dessert on a tight budget. Look, the taste was convincing enough that some folks claimed that they couldn't tell the difference. While it's rarely baked these days, older generations might recall the warm smell of cinnamon floating out of the kitchen when mock apple pie was on the menu. Number 5. Poor man's cookies. Poor man's cookies aren't cookies in the traditional sense. They're more like bars or a soft snack cake. The key characteristics was that this recipe omitted ingredients like eggs, butter, and milk, items that could be expensive or in short supply. Instead, it relied on a mixture of brown sugar, water, flour, baking soda, and sometimes a bit of cinnamon or cloves for flavor. Some recipes added raisins or currants if they were still available, giving a slight hint of sweetness and chew. Honey or molasses could also serve as a sweetener. The batter was then poured into a pan and baked until golden. The result was a dense cake-like cookie that could be cut into squares. The natural moisture from the sugar and water mixture helped keep them from going stale too quickly, a boon for families who needed to make a batch last. This dessert also showcased the era's focus on utility. Poor man's cookies eventually faded away, replaced by more traditional cookies once the economy improved and rationing ended. But for many, these unique bars remain a comforting reminder of how resilience comes in the most unlikely of forms. Number 6. Cornmeal mush fritters. Cornmeal mush fritters serve double duty as both breakfast and dessert. Cornmeal was one of the cheapest grains available, leading to a variety of creative ways to use it beyond bread. These fritters were made by cooking cornmeal mush, which is basically a thick porridge of cornmeal and water, and then letting it cool until it was firm enough to shape into patties or balls. Once cooled, the mush would be dredged in a bit of flour and then fried, the outside crisped up, until the inside remained soft. People often rolled these fritters in sugar or drizzled them with syrup for a sweet treat. Some older recipes suggested dusting with cinnamon to give them extra flavor. These fritters, despite being cheap, were actually quite versatile. Families could adapt the recipe to be savory or sweet depending on what they had on hand. If they had leftover baking grease, they'd fry them up in that. If fresh oil wasn't available, they might just dry cook them in a hot skillet. The result was still a comfort snack that reminded folks of simpler times and resourceful cooking. Number 7. Cottage cheese pie. Cottage cheese pie may not ring a bell for many folks these days, but it was once a praised dessert in certain frugal kitchens. Cottage cheese was widely accessible and relatively cheap, especially if you were living in a rural area where dairy was still manageable. Mixing cottage cheese with sugar, eggs if you had them, and a dash of vanilla created a simple custard-like filling. Some recipes included a pinch of nutmeg or lemon zest. The pie crust was usually homemade from flour, water, and lard, or whatever fat was around. Once baked, the filling set into a firm yet creamy texture reminiscent of cheesecake, but a bit lighter and less sweet. While it didn't have the decadent punch of a real cheesecake, cottage cheese pie offered a decent stand-in for those who couldn't afford pricier ingredients like cream cheese. Today, it's uncommon to see it on menus, but you can still find references to cottage cheese pie in vintage cookbooks and diaries from women who kept families afloat in the 1930s. Its legacy is that of thrift, adaptability, and a willingness to turn the ordinary into something special. Number 8. Molasses sponge candy. Molasses sponge candy, sometimes known as honeycomb candy or sponge toffee, offered a unique airy texture that was inexpensive to produce. Molasses was cheaper than refined sugar, and the candy required few ingredients, just molasses, baking soda, and sometimes a little vinegar. Heating molasses to the right temperature was the trick, as it thickened into a syrup. The baking soda reaction created bubbles that turned the candy into a spongy and delicate treat once cooled. Some families added a thin coating of chocolate if they had cocoa or leftover bits of chocolate around. Others just kept it plain, snapping off a crunchy shard to chew on. The flavor was robust, a bit smoky and bittersweet, which might not appeal to everyone today, but back then, it gave children a sense of excitement to see the mixture foam up when the baking soda was stirred in. While it has largely vanished from the mainstream dessert trays, a handful of old-time candy shops still produce variations of it. It's a testament to the ingenuity of an era, making sweets with minimal resources and a little bit of chemistry magic. Number 9. Vinegar pie. Vinegar pie, much like water pie, stands as a testament to how well Americans improvised. Instead of using fruit juice or fruit puree to flavor a pie, thrifty cooks used vinegar to give a tart zing to the filling. The rest was basically sugar, eggs, butter, or margarine, and flour or cornstarch to thicken. The short supply of fruit demanded creative alternatives. The pie was surprisingly tangy, almost reminiscent of a lemon pie filling, though obviously with a sharper edge. Baking balanced out the strong vinegar flavor, so the end result was sweet with a subtle tartness. Recipes varied. Some folks used apple cider vinegar for a mellower taste, while others stuck with white vinegar. The pastry shell was a typical flour and shortening style crust. In times of hardship, the frugality of vinegar pie was a lifesaver. And looking back, it's a prime example of necessity breeding invention. People discovered that a little vinegar, sugar, and love could help replicate the feeling of biting into a slice of fruit pie without the fruit. Number 10. Bread pudding with custard. Bread pudding has been around for centuries, but it became especially relevant during the Depression. Stale bread was a given in many homes, and throwing it away was unthinkable. Bread pudding turned dry slices into a sweet, hearty dessert. The base typically included milk, often evaporated or powdered. sugar, eggs if available, and whatever spices were on hand, usually cinnamon or nutmeg. Now, baking these ingredients transformed the bread into a custardy dish. The real star was often a simple custard sauce poured on top, made of sugar, milk, and maybe a bit of cornstarch or flour for thickening. Vanilla extract added some depth, though sometimes folks substituted lemon or almond extract if that's all they had. The sauce would soak into the spongy bread, creating layers of sweetness. Bread pudding not only satisfied sweet cravings, but was also dense enough to feel like a treat. It lingered longer in the collective memory than some other Depression-era desserts because it still appears on modern menus, albeit some embellished with fancy sauces or toppings. Number 11. Potato candy. Potato candy raised eyebrows then and still does now. It used leftover mashed potatoes to create a candy dough, which was then sweetened with powdered sugar until it formed a workable paste. The dough was rolled out onto a sheet, spread with peanut butter, and then rolled up jelly roll style. After chilling, it was sliced into pinwheel shapes. The potato might sound odd, but it was actually a cheap binding agent that also kept the candy moist. Powdered sugar was a pantry staple for some, and peanut butter was a protein-rich spread that offered an affordable alternative to pricier fillings. Some recipes replaced peanut butter with jam, or just sugar and cinnamon if that's all they had. Children were thrilled to see the spiral shapes. For many who grew up in the early to mid-1900s, potato candy was a sweet memory that reminded them that even the humblest ingredient can be turned into something special, given enough creativity. Number 12. Graham cracker mock custard. Graham cracker mock custard was another inventive approach to replicate a milk-based dessert without using much milk. Pulverized graham crackers were mixed with water or evaporated milk, sugar, and sometimes eggs or gelatin to form a custard-like consistency. The idea was to mimic that creamy texture without the cost of a standard custard. Occasionally, a small amount of vanilla or almond extract might be stirred in to give it more dimension. The mixture was poured into a pie crust or small ramekins and then set in the refrigerator or a cool windowsill. This dessert didn't always hold up well in warmer climates if you lacked refrigeration. Still, it worked well enough to satisfy a craving when folks wanted something a little more refined than bread pudding. Many home cooks loved how the crackers provided a crunchy element or base for the custard. Graham cracker mock custard is a prime example of maximizing the textures and tastes you can get out of everyday items. Number 13. Oatmeal muffin cakes. Oatmeal muffin cakes were a cross between oatmeal cookies and small cakes. People often baked them as muffins or in square pans to slice into bars. Oats were inexpensive and widely distributed by relief organizations. The ingredient list featured rolled oats, flour, a bit of sugar or molasses, baking powder, and water or milk if you were lucky. Cinnamon, nutmeg, or even grated citrus zest might be tossed in if you had it on hand. The cake part came from the soft crumb that formed when oatmeal was well hydrated. They baked up moist and tender, often surprising those who expected a bland snack. Since raisins or other dried fruits were sometimes tossed in, that gave them a sweet pop. Though they're less of a novelty these days, their place in Depression history stands for how a simple grain became the backbone of so many sweet or semi-sweet recipes. Number 14. Biscuit shortcake. Biscuit shortcake was not the strawberry shortcake that we think of today, brimming with whipped cream. Instead, folks used plain biscuits, often made without butter, sometimes just flour, water, and baking powder, and then topped them with stewed or canned fruit. In a sweet twist, the biscuits might contain a pinch of sugar, but that wasn't guaranteed. The fruit topping could be whatever was available, from overripe peaches to a runny jam made from leftover fruit scraps. Some families turned to applesauce or even stewed raisins if fresh fruit was too expensive. Canned peaches were a special treat if one had the ration stamps or the spare change. As for whipped cream or ice cream, well, those were luxuries that most couldn't afford. Instead, a dollop of evaporated milk or condensed milk might serve as the cream topping. Biscuit shortcake is a shining example of stretching resources to the max. It felt like a dessert despite being made from standard pantry items, bridging the gap between practicality and sweet satisfaction. While shortcake hasn't vanished, the basic version that flourished in the 1930s is seldom seen today. That version captured the essence of an era. Simple, unembellished, yet capable of lifting spirits. Number 15. Honey bun cake. Honey bun cake is believed to be an adaptation from the Depression era, though it's morphed into different forms over time. The original approach might have been more bread-like, leveraging honey as the sweetener instead of granulated sugar. This made sense when sugar was rationed, yet honey might be locally produced or even more affordable in rural communities. Flour, baking powder, water, and a single egg, if available, were combined with honey to create a thick batter. Some folks added cinnamon or nutmeg to give it more complexity. Once baked, it formed a dense, slightly sticky cake that was reminiscent of a honey bun pastry. If times weren't too tough, a drizzle of icing made with powdered sugar and water might be spread on top. Honey bun cake was a slice of comfort that tapped into the timeless flavor of honey while emphasizing the frugality of an era. Number 16. Apple cider pudding. Apple cider pudding was a dessert that capitalized on the availability of cider and minimal use of sugar. Many families who had access to apple orchards would press their own cider, which was cheaper than buying store-bought fruits or juices. The pudding was crafted by simmering apple cider with a small amount of sugar, molasses, cornstarch, and spices like cinnamon or cloves to make a thick pudding. Some recipes called for leftover biscuit dough dropped in spoonfuls on top of the simmering cider mixture, forming a dumpling-like topping. Other variations baked the pudding in the oven until it's set. Either method delivered a warm, comforting bowl of apple-flavored sweetness. For families who grew apples on their property, this treat was a no-brainer. The fermentation of the cider, it wasn't an issue if the cider was fresh enough, but sometimes there was a tang if it was slightly fermented. Still tastes pretty good. Today you won't find apple cider pudding in cookbooks, but in certain rural areas, it still might pop up in family recipe collections. Number 17. Cocoa biscuits with syrup. Cocoa biscuits with syrup was a no-frills dessert that revolved around cocoa powder, one of the more affordable forms of chocolate flavor back in the day. Families would stir a spoonful of cocoa into a basic biscuit mix, turning the dough into a chocolate-laced bread. For sweetness, some people added a hint of sugar or relied on a homemade syrup that they poured over the finished biscuits. That syrup might be a simple concoction of cocoa, sugar, and water heated to a pourable consistency. The dessert wasn't as sweet as a modern-day chocolate pastry, but look, it still offered a hint of that cocoa flavor that kids loved. Butter was rarely used for this recipe in the leanest times, so the biscuits might be crumbly and dry if overbaked, hence the need for syrup to soften them. While it has mostly faded into the recesses of culinary history, cocoa biscuits with syrup remains an emblem of how a dash of chocolate could brighten the darkest of days. Number 18. Spice card pudding. Spice carrot pudding was an economical cousin to carrot cake. Carrots were more affordable and accessible than other vegetables, and their natural sweetness lent themselves well to desserts. This pudding was typically a steamed concoction of grated carrots mixed with flour, a bit of sugar or molasses, baking powder, and warm spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, and allspice. Raisins or dates, if on hand, added extra sweetness. The mixture was then placed in a mold or tin and steamed on the stovetop for an hour or so until it's set into a dense, moist pudding. Some households improvised a sauce from sweetened condensed milk or just sprinkled sugar on top. Steamed puddings like this go way back in American cookery, but during the Depression, they became a mainstay for those lacking the ovens or the funds to run them frequently. Spice carrot pudding vanished once prosperity returned, overshadowed by fancier confections, but for those who grew up on it, the memory of that warm, fragrant treat persists, reminding them of how little was needed to produce a dessert that felt special. Number 19. Peanut butter bread. Peanut butter bread functioned both as a snack and a dessert in Depression-era homes. It was a simple, quick bread with flour, baking powder, peanut butter, and just enough liquid, water, milk if you had it, to form a batter. A bit of sugar or honey might be added for sweetness. Once baked, the loaf had a slightly crumbly texture but was still moist and nutty. For desserts, slices of this bread were sometimes topped with jam or a drizzle of sweetened condensed milk, transforming them into a treat that felt more indulgent. Children especially loved the peanut butter. Stats from that era confirm peanut butter's rising popularity due to its protein content and relative affordability. It was sometimes one of the few ways that families could get a concentrated dose of protein. Peanut butter bread is a perfect illustration of practicality. It was easy to make with minimal equipment and ingredients, and it stored well. The novelty factor was that people in the 1930s would try anything to keep their kids happy. While not specifically a sugary dessert, it was sweet enough to be considered a special treat back then. Over time, the bread was overshadowed by richer, fluffier confections, but it remains a hidden gem of the Depression era. Number 20. Dumplings in sweet sauces. Dumplings in sweet sauce, also known as the poor man's dessert dumplings, was a warm, comforting dish that required only a few ingredients. The dough was made from flour, a bit of fat or shortening, and water or milk. Once formed, small balls of dough were dropped into a simmering sauce made from water, sugar, molasses, or fruit syrup. As the dumplings cooked, they absorbed the sweet liquid, puffing up into tender treats. Some families added a pinch of cinnamon or raisins to elevate the dish. Even a cheap jar of jam would be diluted with water and sugar to form the simmering sauce. The result was a bowl of soft, syrupy dumplings that filled the home with a comforting aroma. This dessert could stretch across several family members, satisfying sweet cravings with minimal expense. While dumplings have remained popular in savory dishes, the sweet dessert version faded once rationing ended and more elaborate confections became affordable again. Still, it holds a special place in American culinary lore. I hope you found this nostalgic walk through 20 cheap Depression desserts both informative and oddly comforting. It's a tribute to our grandparents' and great-grandparents' creativity and resilience, proving that even in the toughest of times, a little sweetness can shine through. Hey, look, these old-school treats might inspire some kitchen experimentation today, so if you're new here, be sure to subscribe to our channel, comment below if you're going to try any of these, and be sure to follow for more fascinating culinary throwbacks and useful cooking tips. Thanks for watching, and here's to honoring the past, one humble dessert at a time.